Welcome to my presentation about Chernobyl, nuclear reactors, and nuclear fission. Here's a table of contents. An overview. The disaster associated with Chernobyl on April 26, 1986 happened with the fourth reactor in the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant in the city of Pripyat. This is the biggest nuclear disaster of all time. It released a lot of radiation into the environment, posing many negative health effects and environmental effects. Additionally, the cleanup was very expensive and required much effort from hundreds of thousands of personnel to mitigate. It is not confirmed how many people were affected. The disaster resulted from a safety test that went wrong, a lack of safety procedures, and because of the reactor's unique design. This is what the fourth Chernobyl nuclear reactor looked like, and here's what it looks like after the disaster. Nuclear reactors all work under one main principle: nuclear fission, or the separation of an atom. Fission happens when a heavy fissile isotope, fissile simply meaning it can go under fission, is hit with an electron, causing it to split apart into two smaller atoms and release three neutrons. One neutron went in and three were released. When these new neutrons are released, they go ahead and split apart more atoms until millions of atoms are undergoing fission, which creates a lot of heat energy. Before we begin on the events that unfolded, it is important to understand the key characteristics that go into a nuclear reactor: fuel, the moderator, control rods, the coolant, the steam generator, and the steam turbine. All of these come together to make the nuclear reactor. Here's a diagram of a pressure water nuclear reactor, the most common form of nuclear reactor. Now let's focus on some of those components with more depth. Almost all fission reactors in the world use uranium as fuel in the form of rods, made out of uranium oxide. Many of these fuel rods are necessary to create a significant amount of energy. In newer reactions, a neutron source is required to kickstart the chain reaction, and this is done for safety reasons, allowing more control over the nuclear reaction. Moderators are materials put in the reactor core that are responsible for slowing down neutrons emitted by the uranium so that they can hit other uranium atoms and continue the chain reaction. A moderator could consist of water or graphite. Control rods are rods that are designed to completely absorb neutrons emitted, stopping them from being able to break apart other uranium atoms in different fuel rods. These rods are used to control, restrict, or even stop the nuclear reaction, and this is because they can be removed and inserted into the core as desired. Fission gets really hot, and so the fuel rods need to be cooled down in order to avoid melting the core. Some sort of coolant is required for this. Usually water is used. If the moderator is water, that can also act as a coolant as well. Steam generators are required in most nuclear reactors to turn the pressurized water into steam. To power a steam turbine, which is hooked up to a generator to make electricity. Chernobyl used special RBMK 1000 reactors that use graphite blocks as moderators instead of water. RBMK, when translated, means high power channel reactor. The most common type of nuclear reactors, pressure water reactors, release clean steam into the atmosphere, and they do not release any greenhouse gases or radiation. RBMK reactors, on the other hand, recycle the steam it creates, which results in very hot water being used to cool the reactor core, and this leads to steam bubbles forming in the core. These steam bubbles are also known as voids. These voids are worse at slowing down neutrons than water, so the reaction becomes more intense as the bubbles form. However, they can be hard to control at sometimes. So looking at this diagram here, we have the outer system of an RBMK reactor. The steam is coming here, it's going to the turbine, it's generating electricity, and as it comes into contact with the coolness with the pond, it condenses into water, which gets pumped back to be used in the reactor. Chernobyl used a pond, and after the explosion it became really contaminated. More than that, the fuel rods are each placed into their own pressure tubes through which the water moves through, cooling the fuel rods in the process. The benefit of this design feature is that it's very easy to refuel the reactor, so much so that this can be done while the reactor is running. The graphite blocks are placed around the tubes, separating them. Here's another diagram where it may be easier to see the separate pressure vessels or tubes. As you can see, these green channels are their own pressure vessels. The safety test. Even after a nuclear reactor is shut down, whether accidental or purposeful, it still continues to generate heat. Not as much so, but it's still enough to require coolant to be pumped around the core. In the event that power is lost, Chernobyl had 3 backup generators which could reach full load within 90 seconds. There was a potential safety risk there. If a blackout occurred and one coolant pipe burst, there may not be enough time for the generators to reach the max power output. And this would be needed to compensate for the lost water due to evaporation. Therefore, it was theorized that the cooling system may be able to run off the steam turbine that continues to spin after the reactor shuts down, as you can see over here. It would be able to power the cooling system for roughly 45 seconds, giving enough time for the generators to reach max load. After 3 failed tests for various reasons, a 4th one was planned to take place at 2:15 p.m. on April 25, 1986, to test whether this was realistically possible, although theoretically it was. It would occur before a scheduled reactor shutdown, and the reactor core was to be kept between 700 and 1000 megawatts. At 2 p.m., the Kyiv electrical grid controller requested the test be postponed due to the increased energy demand at the time of day. When the test was allowed to begin again, the night crew, who was not trained for this test at all, had started their shifts at 11:04 p.m. However, due to a phenomenon called xenon poisoning, the reactor was only producing 500 megawatts. They then decided to switch the reactor power control from local automatic regulator to automatic regulators, which gave them manual control over the power level. This would then result in the power output reaching 30 megawatts, near shutdown levels. Eventually the test was up and running, but most of the control rods were pulled out, and there were less than there should have been. But this was not known to the engineers, however, because the reactor did not have instruments for such applications. The core was very unstable, and it was possible for a runaway increase in reactivity without anything to control it. The coolant was also being run extremely quickly, which was a bad thing, because coolant would enter the core near boiling point, and some of the water would form voids in the pressure vessels. These voids moderate neutrons worse than water, so the reaction would hasten, which would result in higher temperatures, which would result in a positive feedback loop thanks to continuously increasing coolant flow rate. However, the test was a success though, ignoring all the alarms that went off during preparations. Emergency shutdown. The emergency shutdown button was pressed at 1:23 a.m. on April 26, which was intended to shut off the reactor. This would not be the case, however, not instantly, because of a slight but very critical oversight in the RBMK reactor design. Essentially, when the button was pressed, the control rods would all be inserted into the core, even the manual ones. However, instead of immediately decreasing reactivity, it would increase it initially due to the control rod's design. Unfortunately, this behavior was seen before in another RBMK reactor, but it was believed that this would not be significant to consider. This was a widespread belief too, but it would. After the emergency shutdown, the reactor would jump to a power output of at least 30,000 megawatts. Although the events following this are unclear, this most likely resulted in steam exploding out of the reactor. This resulted in more steam forming and loss of coolant, which caused the reactor's thermal output to increase even further. A second, more powerful explosion occurred, breaking apart what was left of the core and releasing radiation into the environment. Response. The crisis management with Chernobyl was awful. Firstly, the entire roof of the building was constructed out of a flammable material, and during the explosion, material caused a fire to start on reactor number 3. Workers were told to continue working in the dangerous conditions. Firemen were eventually called to handle the situation, but they were not told of the radiation. They came to the reactor with the thought of it being an electrical fire. Many people died, either then or later, by radiation sickness. Hundreds of personnel were exposed to harmful amounts of radiation. People in the surrounding area were not evacuated once the explosion occurred. Instead, evacuation only began once people reported headaches and became ill. Despite all of this, important figures in the Ukrainian government brushed this off as a little incident and claimed that people were fine when asked. It was only much later into the day when an investigation was underway. The evacuation finally began at 2 p.m. of the next day. People were told temporarily to evacuate their homes and not to worry because the situation was under control. However, the people were also told to bring what was absolutely necessary. The thing I find sad about this is that pets were excluded from the list of important items. Many pets were left abandoned on the streets of Pripyat, where the evacuation initially happened, and they're still there to this day, although not the same dogs, but their descendants. 1 megameter, or 1,000 kilometers away in Sweden, radiation could be detected. After investigation, the Swedish Radiation Safety Authority concluded it must have come from somewhere else. They asked the Soviet government, but were told everything was fine. After threatening to bring this into global eyes, the Soviets admitted to an accident taking place. If you look here, this black dot on Ukraine is where Pripyat is. This is where Chernobyl happened. And over here in Sweden, that black dot is where they found that radiation. So that far away, radiation could be spotted. They stated to the public that only a minor accident took place, but once over 100,000 people were evacuated, the world began to understand the dire situation. Although this disaster has a maximum incident rating on the International Nuclear Event Scale, this one was far worse than Fukushima, who shares the same title. This was a very rare accident compared to most nuclear reactors, which are minor, often not affecting people at all. Thorium reactors. The biggest safety issue with nuclear fission is that you can't stop uranium from undergoing nuclear fission once it starts. On the other hand, thorium requires another element, plutonium, to function properly. Now this might not sound like a good thing, but if the reactor does get out of hand, the molten thorium can simply be drained away from the plutonium, ending the nuclear reaction. Many scientists believe the future of nuclear reactors lies within thorium. Thorium is a very unique element, and scientists have been becoming more aware of its properties and use of nuclear reactors for a while now. But more than that, mining thorium is much easier than it is to mine uranium. Uranium releases deadly radon gas, which is also carcinogenic. This clearly poses a threat to the workers trying to extract the uranium, so for their own safety, they must invest more time and money into getting that gas away. This is a picture of an abandoned uranium mine maybe you can guess why. Once the uranium is mined, it still isn't usable yet, because most uranium in the earth is not fissile, meaning they can't make a nuclear reaction. So they have to be enriched to increase the concentration of uranium-235. Thorium is about 4 times as abundant in the Earth's crust. It doesn't release any gas and does not need enrichment at all. So most uranium in the Earth is uranium-238, which is not fissile. So we have to increase the concentration of U-235 in the ore of uranium in order to actually create a viable nuclear reaction, which this obviously costs more time and more money. But thorium just cuts straight through all that. In terms of being the fuel source to a nuclear reactor, thorium is useless. In a way, thorium is not the material that makes a chain reaction occur. Instead, it turns into or transmutes into uranium-233 after a couple of weeks. And this unnatural isotope of uranium is much better at creating a chain reaction than uranium-235. Thorium as the fuel source has many pros. It is 3 times more abundant, there's no enrichment needed, it's easier and cheaper to mine. Thorium cannot sustain a nuclear chain reaction on its own. It requires plutonium, and therefore it can be stopped mid-reaction, which is good for safety. It is more energy dense than uranium, and estimated 200 times more dense than uranium. And 1 ton of thorium is equal to roughly 3.5 million tons of coal. Thorium produces 1% the nuclear waste that uranium does, and it is less weaponizable, meaning it cannot be used in nukes as easily. A few cons that thorium has is people have already invested a lot of research and money and time and resources as well into uranium nuclear reactors. It'll be really expensive to kickstart thorium reactor usage too. And thorium's usage creates uranium-232 as well, which emits gamma rays, and the only way to solve this would result in the creation of weaponizable uranium. So, after all that has been said, should you worry about another Chernobyl? Yeah, you really should. Well, what I mean is that Chernobyl should be scary. It should be something we remember. It is important that people are afraid of nuclear power. It is a new source of energy production that could be terrible if it goes wrong. And that is why we need to make sure we are cautious with how we go about nuclear energy. Nuclear fission is undoubtedly the future of energy due to its incredible energy density. Well, until fusion becomes a thing, of course. There's also the issue of nuclear radiation and waste. However, that is an issue that's been mostly solved too. It is something that just needs to become widespread, just like the reactors themselves. The only time radiation and waste really becomes a problem for health is when a reactor malfunctions, and with current safety standards being improved, that idea should become a thing of the past. The silver lining of this is that at least this wake-up call did not happen in a heavily populated area. At least this incident happened in the early stages of nuclear power, early enough to be able to prevent future incidents where they might be able to cause more damage. If something like Chernobyl and even Fukushima did not happen then, it would have most likely happened later, as these disasters motivated engineers and scientists to make safer nuclear reactors.